In this video, I'll show you how to bleed SRAM hydraulic mountain bike brakes that use the new bleeding edge tool. Now, I did make a previous video on how to bleed SRAM hydraulic brakes, and I used road brakes in that video, but it would also work on the older style mountain bike brakes. But the newer brakes that use the bleeding edge tool are quite a bit easier to bleed. There's less steps involved. To do this, you'll need the SRAM bleed kit, and make sure it's the newer kit that has the bleeding edge tool. You'll need some DOT fluid, which usually comes in the kit. Just make sure you have some. You'll need some rubber gloves. You'll need a 4 and a 2.5 millimeter Allen wrench, and it's also helpful to have a torque wrench. I'm starting this process with the wheel removed, so go ahead and remove the wheel of the caliper and brake system you'll be working on. You want to remove this little safety clip, and it's easiest to do this with a pair of needle nose pliers. Now take a 2.5 millimeter Allen wrench and undo the bolt that holds your pads in. And then simply lift out your brake pads. Make sure you don't touch the inside of your brake pads with your fingers. Now we're going to install the bleed block, and these do come with the SRAM bleed kit. And it's going to depend on which style of brake you have. These are the guide with the 4-piston brakes, and this one tends to fit in there easier for me. Now on the rear brake, you can just leave it like that. On the front brake, it may be a good idea to thread the bolt back through here just to make sure this does not come out. Now we're going to put the dot fluid in the syringes. Make sure you have your safety gloves on. So if you have the bleeding edge tool, in other words, your brakes use the bleeding edge tool, you're only going to fill this one with just a little bit of fluid. I'd say maybe a quarter of the way full or less. After you fill it up, you want to put a rag with a little bit of water on it and just push the plunger all the way up to get all the air bubbles out. You can see those air bubbles coming up. And once there's no more air bubbles, close it off. For the lever syringe, which has this kind of tip, you're going to fill it 3/4 of the way full. Take the rag, put it over the tip, and push all of your air bubbles out. Once you have all the air bubbles out, close it off as well. I like to rotate the lever up. It's not a required step, but I think it's a good practice. You are going to have fluid drip out when you remove the syringe, but I like to have this pretty level. So it's just a step that I would recommend. Now, if you have a pad contact dial, which will be right about here, what you want to do is you want to back that dial out all the way, so the opposite way of the arrow, which is counterclockwise. So back that out if you have the pad contact dial right here. SRAM recommends adjusting your reach adjustment knob to where the lever is 75 to 80 millimeters from the center of the handlebar. So the tip of the lever to the center of the handlebar, 75 to 80 millimeters. Now you're going to take a T10 Torx wrench and remove the bleed port screw from the lever. You want to have a wet paper towel or wet rag handy for most of the rest of this procedure, just to wipe away any fluid that may drip out. Water will neutralize the dot fluid. Now we're going to install the lever syringe, which has this tip. So just screw that into the bleed port. Have it be snug, but you don't have to tighten that super tight. On the caliper, you'll remove this little plug. Take a 4 millimeter Allen wrench and just loosen this to where it you feel it kind of come loose, and then just tighten it just a tiny little bit. The bleeding edge tool, you're going to press it in until you hear it click. Now we're going to loosen the bleeding edge tool one whole turn. Okay, since we've loosened it already with the Allen wrench, that should be easy to start to turn. And SRAM says do not go more than 2 turns, but all you need is 1 turn. And now we're going to open up the syringe. Up at the lever, you're going to undo the clamp, and we're going to press down the lever syringe, and I like to hold the caliper syringe vertically when we do this. So remember, both syringes should be open now. Make sure the caliper syringe is open. And we're going to push down, so we're pushing fluid through the system. As you do, you're going to see air bubbles come up at the opposite end, so at the caliper, and you're going to see the plunger go up. And you're going to press down. Make sure you stop before the tip of the plunger goes to the very bottom. Now at this point you want to check the caliper syringe and make sure that the fluid is not discolored. If it's been a long time since you've done this, so the fluid is really old, it may be discolored. If it is, at this point you want to remove the syringes and then refill them and start again, so you're pushing fresh fluid all the way through the system. After you pressed it down, we're going to pull back up on the lever syringe and the caliper syringe will go down. Now I found it's helpful to push down a little bit, slight pressure on the caliper syringe. It just makes it easy to pull up on the lever syringe. And then you want to repeat this. So we're going to push back down the lever syringe. The caliper syringe is popping up, and then pull it up. Keep doing this 2 or 3 times. Down at the caliper, we're going to close off the system with the bleeding edge tool. We'll finish the bleed back up at the lever, so first squeeze and release the lever. I've still got the clamp open. I'm going to pull up on the syringe and you may see some bubbles come out. Then push back down on the syringe. Pull back up and keep doing that a couple times, maybe 3 times, until you just see a tiny little amount of bubbles coming up. I'm not seeing any, so I'm good. And then to finish off, you're going to pressurize the system by pushing down on the plunger and then close off the clamp. Now we're going to unthread the syringe from the lever. Now when you do this, because we've pressurized the system, you will have dot fluid come out, so don't freak out. Make sure you have a wet paper towel or wet rag handy to wipe up the fluid, because it will spill out. This is why I really recommend rotating the lever up. Wipe off any fluid that comes out. And then we're going to thread back in the bleed port screw. And remember, this is a T10 Torx wrench to thread the bleed port screw back in. Snug up the bleed port screw to about 2 Newton meters, and then again take your wet rag or paper towel and wipe off any excess dot fluid. This is the time where you're going to remove this syringe, so you're just going to pop it out. Now because we've already tightened it with the bleeding edge tool, you're not going to have any fluid come out, and that's the beauty of this new bleeding edge tool. It works really well. Then take a 4mm Allen wrench and tighten this back up. I said 2 Newton meters, it's actually 1.5 to 1.7, both on the caliper and the bleed port screw up at the lever. Put the rubber plug back in, make sure it's all the way in there. Take your wet rag or wet paper towel and just wipe off any fluid. Remove your bleed block and reinstall your brake pads. I would recommend taking the gloves off that you were using, because you don't want to get any DOT fluid on your brake pads. If you do, they will be ruined. So either do it with bare hands, or if you feel like it, you can put some other gloves back on, but just make sure they're clean gloves. Take your bolt, thread it back through, tighten the bolt, reinstall the little safety clip. Just press it back on with your fingers. If you did rotate your lever, you just want to rotate it back to where you had it. Then just reinstall your wheel and you are done. So that's how you bleed SRAM hydraulic brakes that use the bleeding edge tool, which, like I said at the beginning of the video, makes this job easier and less messy. Any questions or comments that you have, drop those below. Thanks for watching.